What's going on, Draft Junkies? We are back here with another episode of the BackDraft podcast. Merry Christmas to all our listeners out there. We're a couple days away from Christmas, only 2 days out to be exact. So Merry Christmas to everyone listening, all our dozens of listeners. Hope everyone's getting ready for a couple days with your family, and we pass along our Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, all that good jazz to you. So without further ado, how are you doing, Ryan?
I'm doing great. And, Santa kind of came early for some NFL teams this weekend because I think going into the weekend, only like 2 teams had clinched playoff spots. And following the Colts loss and the Lions loss, I mean, the playoff situation is pretty much set now. Your Eagles were able to finish off that division title, so congratulations. How do you feel about them this year?
It's good to clinch. Good to wrap that up. Not surprising to see them get the win against the Commanders. Obviously, a team that was kind of battling some injuries. Obviously, Jane Daniels done for the year, and then Marcus Mariota going down in that game too. Kind of an easier road than might have been otherwise, but good to see them get the win and clinch what should be a top 3 seed there, with the Panthers kind of still battling it out in the NFC South, shouldn't be able to leapfrog there. Um, you know, the Eagles at one point were the number 1 seed in the NFC, obviously not looking that way now, but still to have to be able to host a home playoff game in the opening round is always a good thing. And offense looked a little more crisp. Obviously, also going to be good to get. It looks like Lane Johnson and Jalen Carter will probably be back next week against Buffalo. So getting a little healthier as the playoffs get closer. So that's always a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, they would be currently slated, if they don't leapfrog over the Bears into the 2, they would currently be slated to face the Rams in the first round. I think that would probably be the matchup of Wild Card Weekend. You definitely would rather face either the Niners, who looked awfully impressive last night against the Colts, but you'd much rather face them or the Packers, if you could slide one way or the other, I think.
Yeah, I think hard pressed to say you'd almost rather face maybe anybody else than the Rams, the way they're playing right now. Obviously we talked about it before. The Rams have looked quite impressive. Obviously, did come up with the L on Thursday night. Tremendous comeback by the Seahawks to, jump up to that number 1 seed and overtake the NFC West. But still, Rams are an incredibly dangerous team. That offense is, even without Devontae Adams, still is capable of putting an insane amount of points up on the board. You have to think by the time, playoffs roll around, I think they're going to be cautious with, his hamstring injury. I can't imagine they're going to rush him back at all, because I don't think, I don't know if it matters too much where they land. I mean, obviously you want to have as many home playoff games as you can, but in the grand scheme of things, you're not going to put yourself in a bad spot and risk rushing him back. You've also seen kind of the emergence of Blake Corum the last couple weeks, which kind of keeps Kyron Williams a little more fresh. And when that defense is playing well, they're a well-oiled machine. So I think if the Eagles can avoid the Rams, I think that's obviously the best case scenario, and I certainly don't want to see the Rams opening weekend.
Yeah, there's going to be some movement in the lower half of that NFC bracket, I'm sure. In the AFC side, I think the best matchup as it stands right now would be the Patriots against the Texans. That sounds like a really fun game to watch, personally. I don't think anybody wants any piece of that Houston team, even though their offense isn't super dynamic. I mean, they've got plus defenders at, I think, pretty much every position on defense, and can go 5 or 6 guys deep with very strong players on their defensive line. That is just one scary team to have to face, especially with like a second-year quarterback.
Yeah, I think we've talked about it in recent weeks. Houston, if their defense comes to play, it's one of the you know best units that we've seen this year throughout the NFL. They can shut down pretty much anybody, and obviously eh, the Patriots come to town with a quarterback in Drake May that's only in the second year. If he's never played in a playoff game, you never know what you're going to get with a quarterback that's never faced those kind of bright lights. So Houston's defense, comes to play. Anything is possible. You get a low scoring game, and who knows? Maybe the Texans are able to pull off the upset on the road. So I think that would be, that'd be a very interesting matchup. So obviously, whoever is able to pull out the number one seed, whether it's the Broncos or the Patriots, so that kind of battle back and forth over the last couple weeks here is going to be something to watch for sure.
Yeah. And I think that there would be a really fun that would be a really fun game to watch. I can just imagine this like snowy playoff game in New England with Houston and the two teams just kind of trying to grit out that game. I think that would be a really, really enjoyable game to watch. I would love to see those two face off more so than I think Houston against like Denver or Jacksonville or something. I think that's a less interesting game. I think Jacksonville is just primed to completely dump in the playoffs. I don't trust the Jacksonville Jaguars until they prove it to me. But a team like the Patriots who have been good all year and haven't really had to face a ton of great teams on their way to this great record to then face off against a decent offense but a great defense. I think would be that's the primetime matchup I'm hoping for come that first round weekend. One other thing I do want to talk to you about on the NFL, and they've been doing this for a couple years now, but they've got now 3 games on Christmas Day, which used to be an NBA holiday, right? Like the NBA would schedule these great matchups on Christmas Day, and that was kind of their holiday, and they kind of ceded Thanksgiving to the NFL, or the NFL would host a couple of games. It used to be 2, but now it's 3 games on Thanksgiving. What do you think of the NFL playing multiple games on Christmas Day?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just said it. I always looked at it as, the NBA always, kind of gave it up to the NFL for Thanksgiving. They let them have those 3 games um, on that holiday. And then Christmas was always, you got your 5 or 6 NBA games, whatever it was. And, everyone tuned in for the NBA. And, now the NFL's kind of taken over. And, now we've got 3 NFL games. And, it'll be interesting to see kind of what the breakdown is of the ratings. I obviously would think that the NFL kind of always kind of reigns supreme, especially earlier in the season. I don't know how many people, unless you're a diehard NBA fan, is tuning in for some of those, marquee matchups on Christmas Day, unless there's, not a lot on. Um, I think, I think it's a little much for the NFL, especially with 3 games. Maybe if you want to throw one in prime time, maybe I don't have too much of a problem with it. But I think 3 games is a tad overkill. I think that, especially with this year, obviously you don't know what the matchups are going to be, but the matchups are pretty lackluster with some teams that aren't even involved in the playoff hunt. Obviously, when the schedule is made, you don't know that, but the Kansas City Chiefs taking center stage. And I mean, that's about as boring as a team right now as you could possibly get. Not really a matchup that anyone really cares about. Obviously, facing the Broncos, a team that, is primed for that number one seed. So there's interest from, that standpoint, obviously. So in prime time, people care a little bit more. But overall, I always think it's kind of Christmas was the NBA and, Thanksgiving was the NFL, and that's kind of the way it should stay.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a little bit of the NFL getting what's coming to them by stuffing Netflix and Prime Video games down their viewers' throats on Christmas Day, where we're going to get a Cowboys Commanders matchup, which couldn't be less relevant to anything in the NFL. Both have been eliminated from the playoffs. Josh Johnson is going to be starting for the Commanders. The Cowboys really have nothing left to play for. And despite that, they're a touchdown favorite on the road in that game. So, and actually, all three games have strong road favorites going on there. So, I mean, who wants to watch Josh Johnson on Christmas afternoon?
Literally no one.
Nobody. And then in the second game, again, like when they made the schedule, maybe they thought this was going to be a good game because the Vikings were in the playoffs last year and did well. But you don't even have JJ. You don't even have the appeal of JJ McCarthy in this game. You have Max Brosmer, who's going to be starting this game, and the Lions absolutely have to win it. They have to win out, and the Packers have to lose out for them to get in. So the Lions are going to pull out all the stops to win that game. The Vikings have nothing to play for. So that's going to be just a completely boring game. Where if the Lions get up by 14 points, they're just going to run the ball into the ground and shorten the game, try to not get anybody injured for that end of the season matchup where they try to get into the playoffs. And then the Broncos against the Chiefs. The Chiefs are going to be starting Chris Olakun as their starter there. So we're going to get Josh Johnson, Max Brosmer, and Chris Olakun as the three home starting quarterbacks in these three games. And Denver's a 2-touchdown favorite on the road. I can't imagine the last time Denver was a 2-touchdown favorite on the road in Arrowhead, but it was probably back when John Elway was playing or something. But all three of those games are going to be stinkers. I hope they all are, because the NFL doesn't deserve to have good games on Christmas Day, because they need to just leave that holiday alone. They already take up too much of our time with Black Friday game now, and 3 games on Thanksgiving, and Thursday night games every single week, which, other than this past week, which the Rams and the Seahawks game was a true classic, most of those games are just god awful. So I would rather see those 3 games get flexed and or not occur on Thursday and instead occur on Sunday, where it would make the red zone viewing a little bit more interesting by having 3 more games. Because there'll be a handful of plays that are worth watching, but nobody wants to watch the entirety of a Max Brosmer game.
No, I mean, it's going to be brutal. I mean, aside from your fantasy football implications, obviously a lot of leagues will be in championship weekend, and obviously from that angle, people will care for people that have their Cowboys and their Lions and whatnot. But even from a Cowboys perspective, like Joe Milton might be in the game by the third quarter if this is if it's a blowout or something like that. Like it's gonna we could see a snooze fest with a lot of these games, and I just don't think that anybody wants to watch this. And why would you want to watch some of these games when, even if you're like a casual basketball fan, you could turn over and see like Steph Curry take on Cooper Flag or something like that. Like it's maybe a little more interesting, or someone you don't see play quite as often. I think this, it'll be interesting to see what the ratings are, like I said, but I think this might be a little bit of a disaster for the NFL, not as profitable, I think, as they originally thought it might be when these matchups came out.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think the NFL games will outrate the NBA games, and these are some really good NBA games. I mean, you got Spurs Thunder, Wemby against uh, Gilgeous Alexander, and like you said, Steph Curry against Cooper Flag. You got the Rockets and Lakers playing. They're both really good teams this year. And the NBA usually does this. I mean, they usually put good teams on, or at least interesting players on Christmas Day, and they don't overload it with a full schedule. It's not like they put a full 15 game schedule out or something like that. It's 4 or 5 games, and they just go back to back to back all day long. But the NFL will definitely eclipse them in the ratings this year. Um, so shall we turn to the draft question?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's
The
get it going.
1996 NBA draft. Why don't you set it up for us, Chris? What was going on at the time?
Yeah, so 1996 NBA draft ended up very star-studded NBA draft, very top-heavy, as we've seen several of the ones that we've gone in depth on in recent weeks. Um, you know, this very top-heavy, very kind of alluring at the top here. Kind of knew who was going to be the number one pick heading into this one, and not real surprising where the Philadelphia 76ers, who were a team that had been picking in the top 10, had three top 10 picks in the past, I believe it was four NBA drafts, taken Clarence Weatherspoon, Sean Bradley, and Jerry Stackhouse, all in the top 10 in 92, 93, and 95. So back up at the top in 96. So, had not had a ton of success and were only at 18 wins the year before. So, not really a big surprise that they were picking number one. And then, so at the top of that draft, they take Allen Iverson, guard from Georgetown, who, obviously ended up being one of the greater scorers that the NBA had ever seen. And so, turn it over to you. What were kind of your thoughts when Iverson was coming out?
Iverson, I remember that tournament really well because that was a really good NCAA tournament that year, and Allen Iverson is just such an interesting and polarizing. I don't know if he's polarizing anymore, really, but he was at the time. I mean, he was um, he got busted in high school for getting into a street fight or something like that, and was sentenced to this ridiculous prison sentence where he got like a 20-year prison sentence for a relatively low level crime. Um, Ends up getting clemency from the governor of Virginia, and then ultimately goes to Georgetown. He was a relatively small basketball player. He's, in fact, the shortest number one pick of all time. Um, and was just this electric scorer. And amongst all of these huge players on the court, you seem to have just an upper level court vision. He was a very good scorer. Not an absolute dagger shooter like Peja Stojakovic we'll talk about later, but could get to the rim on anybody. Um, as a 76ers fan and living through some of the really bad times of the 76ers prior to this pick, how did you feel as a 76ers fan when they actually got him? I mean, he was a really interesting figure. I mean, he's one of those players that, and there are a lot of NBA players like this. Before I pass it to you, he grew up in legit poverty. Like he was, you know, we'll talk about Kobe later. Kobe did not grow up in poverty. Kobe's father played in the NBA. Kobe had a lot of well-educated people around him, and was put on the right path immediately when he was young. Allen Iverson did not. His mother was 15 when he was born, and he grew up in legit poverty and made it all the way to be a number one pick overall. Obviously, uh, a very watched player when he was at Georgetown. John Thompson, I think, was a great coach for him to have in college. He's the first player ever to leave Georgetown early. And they've had some great players that have come through Georgetown. So when they made that pick, and I think it was pretty obvious they were going to make that pick in that draft, what did you think as a 76ers fan?
Yeah, so Iverson was, that was kind of my early days as a fan growing up. I remember briefly before that with Jerry Stackhouse and some of those guys, and Sean Bradley being a bust and things like that. And Iverson was one of the first players I remember being truly excited about. This, kind of sensational athlete that can do it all. I think maybe your casual fan doesn't even know that Iverson was a tremendous football player that probably could have went on, depending if he went to a big time college program, probably could have had a decent football career too if he wanted to. He's a great two sport athlete. in Virginia, and obviously, the off the field stuff was absolutely insane. Um, but I think Georgetown was the ended up being the right spot for him. I think he kind of got the structure that he probably needed to kind of build up his stock and get to the point where he could be a number one pick. And you know he was just, I don't know if polarizing is the word, but he was just such an explosive athlete. A lot of times you don't see guys at the college level average, 25 points a game. It's, a lot of guys don't put up those kind of numbers, in more of a team atmosphere. And, he was just absolutely electric, no matter what the situation was. As soon as he, gets into the league, I believe it was his rookie year. They played the Bulls one game, and he went head to head with Michael Jordan. Absolutely went off. Um, Crossed him up. It was like one of my first memories of saying, "Wow, this kid is really good, and he's going to be a special player one day." And obviously he was. One of the seasons that obviously I always remember. Obviously, didn't end the way Sixers fans probably wanted it to, but 2001, he wins the NBA MVP and takes the Sixers to the NBA Finals. Obviously, they ultimately lose in five to the Lakers, but they'll always have that game one where he is that classic step back on Tyronn Lue, steps over him. A play that I think most sports fans will always remember. So overall, he was just so much fun to watch. He was just exceptional. His quickness, he just had no fear on the court, and he was a lot of fun to watch.
Yeah. Yeah, he was convicted of, maiming by a mob, at the age of 17 and was given 15 years in prison. That conviction was later overturned by failure of evidence, and the governor of Virginia gave him clemency. Um, he was a truly exciting player to watch. Um, I was in high school at the time. His nickname is the Answer, which is a great nickname. He won the Rookie of the Year. He was in the All Star game a bunch of times. Uh, he's he's in the Hall of Fame. He's clearly a Hall of Famer. Um, and we could spend a long time. And there have been documentaries that have been made about Allen Iverson, but he was just a very polarizing figure. I think he didn't give when he has that famous practice post game interview or pre game interview. I think it was a post game interview. I think he just gave um, very honest answers to reporters when asked questions, as opposed to giving just the by the book answer that well coached and well schooled and people who have had agents around them their entire life. They give those very boring answers to questions by the press. I found him a very refreshing player to watch. I was not a big 76ers fan, but I liked watching him play, and I liked watching him give interviews because I always felt like he was giving honest answers as opposed to just what people wanted to hear. That Georgetown team was really good too. They made the Final Four, I think, or no, I think the Elite Eight, and they ultimately lost in a head-to-head match between number one and number two picks. Um, Ultimately lost to the Massachusetts Minutemen, which had featured Marcus Camby, who was the number two pick in the draft. I remember that tournament, and I remember Marcus Camby because he was just a defensive nightmare for teams. I didn't see another player kind of like him until I saw Shaq play in college. I mean, Marcus Camby was just so big and so long, athletic around the rim, and I think a really good pro overall. Not a bad pick at all at the number two spot. What do you think?
Yeah, I think Marcus Camby was, certainly not flashy, but I think that's, it's certainly not a bust by any stretch. An incredibly dominant college player, and not quite a double double machine, but 9.5 points a game, 9.8 rebounds, certainly nothing to turn your nose up at. Won a Defensive Player of the Year award. Had a very accomplished career. Obviously, did bounce to a few different teams, so maybe not what he could have been, but he was very strong defensively, and was a great rebounder, and just kind of had this imposing presence. Obviously, near 7 footer, just very impressive, and kind of a guy that in college was national player of the year, won the John Wooden Award, and was the reason that UMass was, kind of in that spot. I don't think there's been a ton of times where UMass has been kind of in the national conversation in, the NCAA tournament. So, he was definitely a very impressive player.
Yeah, I find it amazing. I didn't realize this before we started researching for this draft. How does somebody win the Defensive Player of the Year award and not go to the All Star game? I mean, Marcus Camby never once went to an All Star game, despite his overall career was 9.5 points a game, but really during the meat of his career, he was a 12 point a game, 12 rebound guy. I think towards the end of his career, he kind of and at the beginning a little bit, he didn't get the minutes or looks necessary to keep those averages up. But he had a really long career, and during the meat of it, certainly during his prime, he was averaging 13 and 13 and led the league in blocks a few times. Um, I find it inconceivable that he never went to an All Star game.
Yeah, I wonder if he would have averaged a couple more points a game, would that have, if his scoring numbers were a little bit more fruitful, would he have ended up at, an all-star game or two maybe? Because I mean, 12, 13 rebounds a game is pretty impressive. I mean, he did it for, was this, a good, 7, 8 year period where it was double digit rebounds every year. And a lot of those years was getting, 10, 12 points a game too. So, he scores a little bit more. Does he get there? And on a lot of those Denver teams too, that's when, Carmelo Anthony was there at that time. So they were a good team. So obviously, his chances to score probably weren't as, prevalent either. So, you know, maybe take the situation into account there as well.
He ended up getting. He was actually originally drafted by the Raptors. I didn't watch him play a lot for the Raptors, but I did watch him play a lot for the Knicks. He's in a trade involving Charles Oakley, which is the first of a couple of mentions of Charles Oakley we'll probably make on this podcast. But I really remember him as a Nugget. I mean, that's really the
That's where I
team I remember
remember him
him
too, I
playing for.
think.
That's where he had most of his success, I should say. He ended up getting that. UMass had to end up forfeiting that Final Four appearance because of people accepting gifts from agents, including Marcus Camby, who threatened the rest of his college career over a $28,000 gift from a potential agent. The
It's just wild, like looking at all that now, and now like how wild, the college landscape is in the world of NIL, and like how, he took $28,000 from two sports agents, and there's been so many instances of that, like Reggie Bush, and I mean the list is endless. It's just funny how much it's changed.
Yeah, now they're just openly allowed to accept that stuff, and I feel like now that the NCAA allows NIL deals, I feel like they should go back and reinstate um, that Final Four appearance or something, because I feel like there's some amount of injustice there with
Hmm.
them having to forfeit all those wins and that Final Four appearance and that Final Four banner for conduct that now would be openly allowed, I think, and even encouraged within college.
Yeah, absolutely. They'd have to go through and I think, reinstitute a lot of different, championships and wins and, records and what have you. But I mean, in the way that, it is in this NIL era, that I think that should be the way that it is because the way the sport has changed. But I mean, I don't think we're ever going to see that. But at the same time, I feel like that would be the right thing to do.
Yeah. Sharif Abdur-Rahim was the third pick. Again, I think a pretty strong pick overall. He was a, you know, 20-8 kind of guy. Um, had a long career. Played on the gold medal Olympics team in Sydney. Do you have any memories or any thoughts on Sharif Abdur-Rahim?
Yeah, I mean, he was, obviously not, probably not what you would categorize as a superstar, but, went to an all star game. Probably a guy that, maybe is forgotten about a little bit because he ends up playing the start of his career in Vancouver. Maybe forgotten about a little bit, but put out some pretty outstanding numbers with the Grizzlies during those first 5 years of his career, and then ends up with the Hawks after that, and continues to kind of a 20 and 9 somewhere around there for those couple seasons, and then obviously falls off a little bit later in his career when he ends up with the Blazers and Kings. But for the first about 7-8 years of his career was putting up fringe kind of all star numbers, and was an extremely productive player, and I think probably one of the more kind of underrated, um, you know, I guess kind of wings, probably depending on the team, sometimes played at the three, sometimes played at the four, just kind of depended where he was at. But, you know, definitely not a bad pick at all in that spot. Obviously, did well for the Grizzlies and then later after that with Atlanta. So, ended up having a pretty strong career for sure.
Yeah, he's a well-educated guy. I mean, he went to Cal Berkeley. That's not like the easiest school to get into, even as an athlete. After he was done with his career, he did some work as an executive. I think he's the current president of the G League. So he's had an interesting career, I think, post playing as well. But yeah, I agree. I think he's kind of an underrated player, especially in this draft where there's just so many stars. And that leads us to the fourth pick. And actually, before we get to the fourth pick, I'll mention your 76ers were lucky in this draft because the Raptors and Grizzlies weren't eligible for the number one overall pick because they were new expansion teams. And so that took them out of the lottery. They had to forfeit the rights to the number one pick. So that made it easier for your 76ers to get in there and get that Hall of Fame player. But the number four pick was Stephon Marbury, ultimately traded. Uh, it was a draft day trade, I think, where he was shipped off. He was originally drafted by Milwaukee, and then or he was and then traded to Minnesota.
Yes, he was.
But Marbury was a real star. I think he's called Starbury, which is kind of an interesting nickname. But he came onto the scene and really he had big minutes initially, and showed himself on the Timberwolves team to be an extremely good scorer, and certainly worthy of that number four pick. Do you think he's ever going to get in the Hall of Fame? Is he close enough?
I don't think he's probably ever going to be a Hall of Famer. I just don't know if the longevity is there. But I mean, he had a really good career overall. Obviously, right out of the gate, even with Minnesota. McDonald's All American. Had the pedigree right out of the gate. Ended up having some really good years with the New Jersey Nets. I feel like it's kind of forgotten that he was with the Suns. I even forgot that he was there for a
Me
couple
too.
seasons. Um, I think it's more. I think he gets more remembered for his time with the Nets and probably mostly with the Knicks, just because maybe later in his career and obviously being a big time market. But I think the most productive years of his career are probably kind of in that when he ends up with the Nets, and then I don't think he has quite the resume for the Hall of Fame. 19.3 points a game, but I think an underrated playmaker. Um, you know, had several seasons where between 7 and 9 assists a game. Decent rebounder for a guard as well, and fairly underrated defender as well. I think he did have a very, very strong career, I think. And, ultimately, you know, probably just misses out on the Hall of Fame. I don't think he's ever going to get there, but certainly had a great career.
Yeah, a couple of things that I think are interesting about him, not really related to his NBA career. He's one of the few kind of stars in the NBA, and he was definitely a star at the height of his career. That went over and played in China when he was done playing in the NBA. I
Mhm.
assume that was for money. I assume they could pay him more than he was going to make at the end of the bench on an NBA team. He had a long career. He played 9, 10 seasons in China, won some championships over there, and was a big star in the Chinese league. And then second, while he was still in the league, he started this shoe line. And I think Shaq did this too. Where Starbury, Stephon Marbury started this shoe line called Starbury, where he got a deal to make shoes, and at the time, and they still are to a certain extent. And you would know more about this as a sneakerhead than I do, but even back then, Jordans were crazy expensive. They were $100, $150, something like that, which in 1996 was a crazy amount of money, equivalent to probably $400 today. And he started a shoe line where he sold Starbury branded shoes for like $20 at Walmart or something like that, and wanted to do that so that kids who were growing up, and I don't exactly know a lot about his situation, but that suggests to me that he grew up in fairly impoverished state as well. Um, Kids could buy good looking sneakers with an endorsement from an NBA superstar for a fraction of the price of Jordans. So I really thought that says a lot about his character, which I think suggests that he's got a pretty strong character.
Yeah, I always thought that was one of the most, I think, admirable things about him. I had several pairs because they were $14.98. Like you couldn't beat that price for a pair of basketball shoes back then.
Sure.
They sold them at what's called Steve and Barry's. I don't even know if it still exists. I don't believe that it does, as far as I know. But they had it was like an apparel store, but I think that's mostly why people went there. But it was in several different colors of shoes, and high top, low top, and they were pretty solid. Like I remember I had several different colors of shoes, and I mean for a $15 pair of shoes, for especially for you know, kids that maybe their parents couldn't afford a lot, or even if you could, like you could get several pairs for, not a lot of money. I mean, I feel like you can't beat that. And, with like you said, what Jordans cost even back then, you know, Jordans were probably between 150, 175, something like that a pair. You can get, how many pairs for that price? I think it was, it's pretty admirable of Marbury to, kind of try and, help people that, maybe grow up with a little bit less. It looks like he grew up in Brooklyn. You can't really tell if he grew up in poverty or anything like that, but you know, a pretty cool thing to do, and something that, I don't think I've ever seen since. And, I don't know that we'll ever really see too much. But I think Shaq sold his shoes at, was it Walmart or Kmart, something like that. I think back in the day, but kind of the same deal. They were, super cheap and, for a little more of an affordable option as opposed to like Jordan or Nike or what have you.
Totally agree. And that was an interesting trade. Um, the Bucks must have really wanted, or the Timberwolves must have really wanted Stephon Marbury there, because they traded the number 5 picks. So there's just one slot later, plus a future first rounder to move up and take Stephon Marbury. But the number 5 pick was Ray Allen, a sharpshooter who played for Connecticut. He's in the Hall of Fame now. Um, Actually, I didn't realize his stats were quite as good as they were before I started looking more closely at him. Because when he made the Hall of Fame, I was always kind of like, well, has he ever really been like the number one player on his team? Because he won some titles, but it was with those like star-studded Celtics teams. But what are your thoughts on Ray Allen? Obviously, a really great shooter all time.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, what jumps out immediately is, his shooting numbers. One of the, greatest shooter 3-point shooters that obviously we've ever seen. 40% for his career, and over the course of his entire career, really never broke down as a 3-point shooter. Was such an important part of that Celtics NBA title team, and those Heat teams when LeBron was there as well. Such an integral part of that, and certainly, I mean, you could probably in certain portions of his career, probably what you would qualify as a superstar, fringe superstar. Um, Portions of the time when he was with maybe Milwaukee and Seattle was probably the first option, maybe on some of those teams. But you know, Moore will be remembered, I think, is probably one of the greatest shooters that the sport has ever seen. Kind of in that conversation with the Steph Currys of the world, and maybe not quite at that level, but incredibly efficient guy that can hit any big shot, and had an incredibly long career, and just an impressive player overall that just was one of the great shooters.
Yeah, I mean, he was a 10-time All-Star, did win the three-point contest. He was never once an All-NBA first teamer, and only made the second team once and the third team once. That's a relatively light sort of peak of your career to never even be a first team All-NBA. But he's got the rings. He finished, I think, as the all-time 3-point shooter at the time of his retirement. That's obviously been blown away by Steph Curry since then. Um, but a wonderful player. Had an interesting childhood. He moved as a military brat. He moved around the world, lived in Germany for a while, but was a spectacular shooter in the NBA. Also appeared in a Spike Lee movie, along with some other players that
Oh, that's
were
right. I forgot about
in
that
this
one.
draft. Is part of He Got Game. Him and Stephon Marbury, they were both in that movie. And the sixth pick we'll talk about is Antoine Walker. He was part of that absolutely loaded Kentucky team that won the national title that year at the NCAA tournament. And Antoine's never going to get votes for the for the Hall of Fame or anything like that. I think it was overall a very solid player for a while. Um, that Kentucky team was absolutely insane that year. They lost 2 games all season. One game to the number 5 Massachusetts Minutemen that had Marcus Camby on it, and once in the SEC championship game against Mississippi State, who was ranked at the time and ultimately made the Final Four in that tournament. So only 2 losses, and the roster on them. I mean, that team had Tony Delk, Nazi Muhammad, Jeff Shepard, Derek Anderson, Antoine Walker, and Ron Mercer, and also a guy named Walter McCarty, who I'm not aware of, but was also a first round pick in the NBA draft. So just an incredibly loaded Kentucky team. Um, what you grew up watching a lot of Eastern Conference NBA. I'm sure you saw the 76ers go up against the Celtics a lot, so you saw a lot of Antoine Walker. What are your thoughts on Walker?
Yeah, I mean Walker was kind of this is a guy that also had a very long career, and obviously a guy that I remember more with the Celtics than anything else. Obviously, bounced around a little bit later in his career, but um, a very also a very numbers don't really support it maybe quite as much, but a guy that could hit a big shot, a very talented scorer. Kind of for a guy that was more of a he could play a little power forward, play small forward, whatever this scheme kind of needed. But um, you know, he was a guy that was an absolute stud at Kentucky. He ended up in a good spot with the Celtics, and definitely burned the Sixers more times than I'd care to admit. Made some All Star teams. And I think a lot of people forget he was a McDonald's All American as well. So, that kind of pedigree started out early on. And, he ended up having a really strong career, almost 18 points a game. And, also, later in his career ended up, having some, little bit of success, even with, the Heat a little bit at the end. Obviously, he
Got a
was
ring?
yeah, exactly. So I mean, can't that was the was when they beat Dallas, I believe, and when Dwayne Wade was kind of coming into the league there, and so ultimately he had a really strong career. Didn't wasn't he famous for like mismanaging his money or something though, if I remember correctly?
Yeah, he filed for
I think
bankruptcy. He
I
liked to
believe
gamble a little bit too
that's
much, I
right.
think. Owed some debts. He got into some weird. I don't know. He got into some weird legal troubles over the years with various people, people he went to college with, and people that he was on the Celtics with. So I don't know. He was always a very formidable player in the NBA, and like you said, made some All Star teams, and um, isn't going to get any votes for the Hall of Fame, but a very very solid player. Um, the next few picks in this draft are kind of a mishmash of players that had like solid careers. Eric Dampier, Kerry Kittles, Lorenzen Wright. Kerry Kittles I always loved because he wore one sock up high and one sock down low on his two legs. That was his style. I think that made him kind of stand out. But before we talk about Kobe, anything about any of these players that you want to mention?
I don't think nothing that really stands out. I mean, like I said, I don't think there's anyone, kind of in this draft that's like an outstanding bust. Like no one that, is like absolutely egregious that, shouldn't be taken in the spot. Like, Kerry Kittles had a solid career, maybe didn't perform up to the eighth overall, draft spot, but, had some years where he was solid for the Nets and was a strong backcourt piece, and Eric Dampier was a nice rotation big for the Mavericks for some years and some other teams. Jermaine O'Neal was a good player for many years for the Pacers, along with the Celtics, and there's been there were some decent value picks in this draft, but I don't think there was any egregious busts like we've seen in some other drafts. No Darko Milicic or anything like that here.
Yeah. So then the big pick comes down. The Hornets take Kobe Bryant with the 13th pick, which ultimately gets traded to the Lakers. That trade almost fell through because the Lakers were trying to clear their books because they wanted to make an offer for Shaq, who was entering free agency from the Orlando Magic. And so they wanted to trade Vlade Divac off of their roster. I don't know what he was making at the time, but probably more than he deserved. And they wanted to clear his contract off of their books, and they wanted to trade him to the Hornets. And I don't know if he had a no trade clause or something like that, but he wouldn't agree to the trade. He threatened retirement, I think, if he got traded. And so even though the Hornets ultimately made the pick because the Lakers told them to, Hornets weren't interested in having Kobe Bryant there. They would not have picked Kobe Bryant if they had made that pick for themselves. And so it's kind of a wild situation having to get Vlade Divac to agree to a trade to a bad team. I don't think the Hornets were particularly good at that time, to enable them to get this high school kid that nobody thought should be picked that high.
Yeah, obviously, it's crazy to think that they kind of just make that pick, and if Vlade Divac doesn't want to go there, it would have been hilarious if maybe Kobe has to play for the Hornets, or maybe they end up thinking they have to trade him somewhere else. It's very interesting how that whole process kind of played out. Um, if you're looking at Kobe, obviously very successful high school career, played at Lower Merion in the Philadelphia area, made the varsity team as a freshman. Team only had 4 wins his freshman year, and then over the next 3 years was ridiculous. Wins 77 games over the next 3 years, and obviously ends up in the position where he can make the jump from high school straight to the NBA draft. It was the Lakers were trying to shed that salary because they wanted to sign Shaq allegedly, and apparently Kobe reportedly impressed in his pre-draft workouts with the team, and apparently dominated some former Lakers players, Michael Cooper and Larry Drew in particular, and they were just kind of enamored with his potential, and kind of wanted to get him in the fold, and could shed that salary in the process and put them in position to potentially sign Shaq. So kind of double-edged sword, and kind of served a dual purpose with what they could do there, and obviously ends up being one of the greatest draft trades that we've probably ever seen in the NBA. Obviously, Kobe, probably a top 5 player all time on most people's lists, you would think. And, obviously a home run for the Lakers.
Yeah, Kobe's such an interesting player. And this brings me up to something else, and I don't want to risk this going too long. This has already been, we're at like 52 minutes of taping or something. The NBA, I feel like more than any other, and Kobe's right, the centerpiece of this, more than any other sport, fans of the NBA are obsessed with like all-time rankings of things. If you go into like Reddit or Facebook groups or whatever, it's this constant back and forth, repeated debate about who's like the top 5 players all time, who's better all time, Steph Curry or Kobe Bryant, who's better XYZ, which you don't see really in the NFL. Like if you watch NFL podcasts or go onto those forums, like you don't see someone saying like, oh, who are the is John Elway a better all-time player than Walter Payton or something like those kind of comparisons just don't really happen in the NFL. I think because of the different eras are so starkly different as opposed to basketball, which the game has kind of stayed the same over all these years. So why do you think NBA fans are so obsessed with all-time rankings?
I really don't know. I don't know if it's like, is it gatekeeping, like just the different eras, like because you always have the constant debate, like who's the GOAT? Is it Michael Jordan? Is it LeBron James? Like that's the debate that like won't ever die, and probably won't as long as in our lifetime, I'm sure. But it's something, you're right, we don't see in any other sport. Like I guess maybe for a brief period, like as far as like the quarterback position, it was somewhat debated, like Brady or Peyton Manning, but I think with so many positions, like in the NFL and like some of these other sports, like it's not as, it's a little harder to debate. But I guess, only five players on the court. Maybe it's a little easier to debate with the NBA. But I just think the sport maybe, I don't know. I don't know that it changes that much from era to era, but I think, different era of fans just feel the need to, kind of prove that their era is supreme. Like, today's fans are, might always want to say like, oh, LeBron's the greatest player that ever played, and maybe people more our age or a little older, or say Michael Jordan is like. I don't know if it's just gatekeeping in that regard or what it is, but like NBA fans are just obsessed with debating it. I don't know what it is.
I mean, anybody can look up Kobe's, all-time accolades, and he's an all-time great. I mean, he's no worse
Absolutely.
than 12th all-time, probably on people's lists. Maybe if you're a true hater, maybe 15th. But I mean, he was an 11-time first-team All NBA player. Like he's clearly one of the all-time greats. A couple things I think are interesting about Kobe that I did not realize. One, well, first of all, he's really smart. I think you could tell that just by watching him on the court or listening to him after after game interviews and things like that. And he had almost an 1100 on his SATs, which look, that's not going to get you into Yale, but as a high school kid with those kind of basketball skills, an 1100 SAT would have gotten him into pretty much any school he wanted to. He probably could have gone to Duke with that school with that score if he'd wanted to.
Oh yeah.
So I find it very interesting that he decided to jump straight to the NBA as opposed to go to college, where he could have gotten more education. Um, he wasn't in a financial situation where he absolutely had to go start earning money right away. I mean, his father was an NBA player, and yeah, didn't earn the mega bucks that Kobe earned, or certainly the players of today's time earned. But he didn't need to absolutely go straight into the NBA to start earning money. So I don't know why he went straight in as opposed to going to college. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because he was recruited, to some extent. I don't know how far that it went because I don't remember exactly when he, kind of expressed that desire to make that jump. But there were schools like Duke, Michigan, and even Villanova, which is right nearby, kind of Philadelphia's mainline area, which is a very wealthy area in Philadelphia that where Lower Marion is, where he went to high school, they were all very interested in him. So he, obviously had the access to the funds where his dad obviously, like you said, didn't obviously have an NBA career per se, but obviously played internationally overseas, played some time in Italy. So, Kobe had those experiences that, most kids obviously Allen Iverson and him, like we said, came from very different backgrounds, and he had access to a lot of things that most kids didn't. And he could have continued, got more education, and could have played a year or two of college, and potentially elevated his stock even more, and could have been a top five pick. I can't imagine that he wouldn't have if he ends up at a Duke or a Villanova, and you know obviously you'll never know, but he certainly couldn't have done more could have done more at the college level, but he obviously it ends up working out for him in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I remember at the time people thought that pick was a reach. I mean, he was relatively unknown, uh, although at the same time he was kind of also well known, right? Like he took Brandy to his prom, like his high school
Mhm.
prom, right? Like he um he was in that weird circle where he was kind of famous but also not thought of as high a prospect as maybe he should have. It was only the second year where high school players could go into the draft. Kevin Garnett had been picked the year before. So it was just an interesting move on his part. He also, and I didn't know this, and I think this lends to his intelligence as well. He wrote a short movie that won an Oscar. Um, he's the only person in history to have won an Olympic gold medal and an Oscar. He wrote a short movie which had a musical soundtrack by John Williams, and it was called Dear Basketball, or I think was the title of it. I also find that I find it very interesting, the things that players do, sort of like Stephon Marbury with his Starbury shoes. The things that people choose to do off the court, I think, are almost more interesting than what they do on the court, because we see what they've done on the court.
Yeah, it definitely is. I always do forget about that, and he obviously was a super well educated guy, and super interesting. Kind of off the court as much as he was on, and I mean, I feel like that's saying something as much as he accomplished on the court. Um, you know, all that five NBA titles, all the things that he's done, and to kind of point to something like that to be kind of the most interesting is, I feel like really, really saying something, and kind of jumping back to, not right off the bat, kind of being a bit of a question mark of a pick. Like right off the bat as a rookie, didn't really play very much. Only averaged like 7 points a game as a rookie, and was coming off the bench behind guys like Eddie Jones, Nick Van Exel, kind of veteran guards at that time. And, the first couple of years were kind of, is this guy going to be kind of the next star that kind of they thought he would be, and why they traded for him? But ultimately it works out in the Lakers' favor, and obviously they get one of the greatest players that the sport has ever seen.
hmm A couple picks after him was Steve Nash. And I think Steve Nash is an interesting story too. Another Hall of Famer. He uh, won multiple MVP awards in the NBA, and interestingly, won multiple MVP awards in the NBA without ever cracking 20 points a game. Which he obviously had individual games where he scored more than 20, but he never had a season where he averaged over 20 points a game and yet was able to rack up a couple of MVPs. Steve Nash was a completely unrecruited college athlete. He grew up in Canada, and the story goes that his high school coach had to like send letters to a bunch of American colleges, just like begging them to take a look at this kid, because I guess he was lighting it up in Canada, but nobody pays attention to Canadian high school basketball. And Santa Clara, which is where he ultimately went, was like the only school that would look at him. And I guess the coach there just immediately knew that he was going to be a star, and was thankful to sign him to go to college there. But Steve Nash was one of the best passers, if not the best passer in the league for many years. What are your memories of Steve Nash?
Yeah, I mean, he was the guy that was, an incredible playmaker. For a guy that went to a smaller school, a couple of those years, ended up taking Santa Clara to the NCAA tournament, and they ended up one of those years they beat number 2 seed Arizona, which obviously a pretty impressive feat. Obviously those kind of performances ended up getting him drafted, and getting him to a spot where he ends up with the Phoenix Suns, and ends up in Dallas, and ironically ends up back with Phoenix, and that's kind of where he finds himself, and transforms himself into kind of a double machine, and this just sensational passer, on those Suns teams at kind of the mid 2000s with Steve Nash, Amari Stoudemire, Sean Marion, and a lot of those guys. Raja Bell was there as well, if I remember
hmm
correctly. Ultimately didn't win anything, but were always in that kind of Western Conference Final type conversation. We're one of the better teams in the league at that time, and Steve Nash obviously had a lot to do with that. Was just a sensational playmaker for them, sensational passer. Obviously, could score it as well, and was good hit shots when he was open, but wasn't a guy that filled up the stat sheet scoring wise. Was kind of more of a facilitator the majority of the time, and ended up having a amazing career and ended up being a Hall of Famer. And obviously for a guy that went to Santa Clara and worked his way from Canada to a smaller school and all the way up, ended up it's a pretty remarkable story.
Yeah, I think a really smart player, sort of like Kobe. You can just kind of see it on the court. Just the intelligence of knowing where other players are, what their tendencies are, how to best distribute the ball. I think the two of them together. Obviously, Kobe had more just like raw physical gifts than Steve Nash did, but I think Steve Nash was just a very intelligent player. In addition to being a very very good player as well. Um, but he racked up a bunch of accolades over the year. Two-time MVP and was an All-Star a bunch, and three-time first team All NBA, like assist leader, and five times in the NBA. He's just one of the one of the best guards, certainly of the modern NBA. Um, and I think it's amazing given that he was completely unrecruited going into college. But I think a very smart player, and ultimately was a coach for a little while, and I don't think he had a ton of success doing that, but um, an all-time great for sure. Worth mentioning around those picks as well in that first round, Peja Stojakovic and Jermaine O'Neal. Jermaine O'Neal was another high school player, right? He was um, one of the youngest players ever in the NBA, one of the youngest players to ever start in the NBA. He was drafted by Portland, but I remember him obviously as an Indiana Pacer. Just a really physical kind of forward slash center. Um, a lot of skills. Obviously, he didn't have the kind of career Kobe did, but him and Peja was just a sharpshooter. Like he was one of those international players. There were only a handful of international players that year, and Peja was just a great deep three threat for his entire career. One of those guys that can stick in the NBA for a long time because they just are just such a great pure shooter. So, do you have any thoughts on Jermaine or Peja?
I mean, Peja was for a long time. Obviously, started out with Sacramento, but really, had a lengthy career. Had some success even later with the Hornets as well. He ultimately, had a very very long career. Just kind of what you would equate today as like a 3 and D guy, but he was kind of a bigger guy, had that bigger stature,
Yeah,
6'10", and could probably play a little power forward if you needed, and was just a great 3-point shooter, and a very solid rebounder as well on the wing, and maybe not an elite scorer, but kind of one of those fringe type star players that every team needs, and played on some of those Kings teams with Chris Webber, guys like that, and when the Kings were kind of competitive in those early 2000s, and overall had a really strong career, and for a 14th overall pick, kind of outside of the lottery, that was a pretty nice selection, especially pulling it from Yugoslavia. You obviously don't know what you're going to get sometimes when you're scouting those international players.
yeah. I mean, he'd been playing against other men since he was like 15 years old, which I think serves them well, as opposed to a guy like Vitaly Potapenko from the Ukraine, who was picked 2 picks before him, who went to Wright State and was playing against other college kids at a relatively low level college. Like Peja had to really mature. I mean, one being from Yugoslavia in the 90s was its own set of challenges, right? And then going to Greece at like the age of 16, he like went and got his Greek citizenship and went and played in the Greek professional leagues for a while. He's playing against grown men. Like I think that requires a level of self confidence and high level skills that served him well in the NBA. There were some other good players here in this first round. I mean, like Derek Fisher had a long career. Tony Delk was a good player. Not a lot of other stars, but anything else in that first round? Zydrunas Ilgauskas had a long career as a center with those Cavs teams that once LeBron showed up a few years later, had a lot of success. So, anything else you want to say about other players here in this first round?
Yeah, I mean, Ilgauskas had he was a solid big for the Cavs for a lot of years. You know, Derek Fisher, obviously, to get, a solid veteran guard, that late in the first round from especially a smaller school like Arkansas Little Rock is obviously you know, a pretty solid move. You know, at that point in the draft, you're really not sure what you're going to get. Like, you're getting guys that are, probably just rotation pieces. Like Jerome Williams is another guy that, was kind of a front court piece for a lot of teams. Like, didn't play a ton of minutes, but, just kind of a body. Towards the end of the round, not really a ton to speak of. And, especially moving into the second round, there wasn't not many really, names to write home about, but, a lot of noteworthy, players that came out of the first round.
Yeah, and the second round is filled with guys like Jamie Fike and Randy Livingston. There's like 11 guys, I think, in the second round that never once played in the NBA. No real, no real big steals in the second round of this draft. But there is one more player we should talk about, which is Ben Wallace, who was the rare undrafted free agent that had a great NBA career. I mean, there were some other players that played in the NBA for a while. Chucky Atkins played for a while. Darvin Ham played for a while. But Ben Wallace was undrafted he went to Virginia Union, which is a D2 school, and won multiple Defensive Player of the Year awards. Had to go to community college before he went to Virginia Union. So kind of was a completely unheralded player coming out of high school. Um, uh, for a great defensive player, and he played a lot of center, and certainly defended a lot of centers. He was relatively short. He's only 6'9". What are your thoughts on Ben Wallace?
Yeah, Ben Wallace was a premier defensive big man, of that era, of that, kind of early 2000s. Those Detroit Pistons teams of the early 2000s, were, weren't quite a dynasty, but were very strong. Obviously, they win the title in '04. It was part of that, very strong front court with Rasheed Wallace. It was a very, very interesting team because, there wasn't a lot of star power there. Within that starting five, you've got Chauncey Billups, Rip Hamilton, Tayshaun Prince, and then Ben and Rasheed Wallace in the front court. Interesting roster construction there because you don't have a lot of egos, just a lot of, pure talent and, kind of hardworking players. And, Ben Wallace kind of fit into that roster perfectly. Just a supremely talented defensive player. It's a guy that led the league in blocks one year. 4-time defensive player of the year, and just was a force down low. Like, he was one of those guys where you're going to take the ball in the drive. Like, you have to be sure that you're going to get the shot up because there's a chance that that's getting blocked. He was just, kind of a force on the interior, and, I mean, how could you forget that huge afro that he had back in the day? I mean, that was just, that was iconic, and he was just, he was just a dominant, force down there, and was a fun player to watch from a defensive standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, never cracked 10 points a game over the course of his career. I don't know what his all-time high scoring was, but it probably wasn't more than that, much more than that. I think he was a terrible free throw shooter, if I remember correctly. Um, Famously went to, yeah, he was a he was a sub
41,
50% free throw shooter.
yeah, 41.4% for his career.
His high the high water mark of his career was 49% from the line,
Woof.
which is brutal. I mean, that's Shaq territory, right? I don't even know. Shaq may have even been better than that. Um, but this is our second Charles Oakley mention of this podcast, which I didn't expect there to be multiple. He met Charles Oakley at a basketball camp. So Charles Oakley is out there cashing checks at some basketball camp, and he sees this kid. Probably reminds him a little bit of himself, right? Charles Oakley was kind of a tough, hard defensive player for the Knicks, and says, "Hey, you should go to Virginia Union, where he went," and kind of becomes this kid's mentor. And I don't know if it's because of grades or what have you, but Ben doesn't go there immediately, but goes there after playing pretty well for a community college for a couple of years, and goes undrafted, and then goes over to Italy to try out for a team over there, and signs with Washington Bullets, which is now the Wizards. Bounces around a little bit, but yeah, one of the handful of best defensive players of all time. And I think what makes these players kind of great is he's just relentless, just could not be stopped. I think Charles Barkley's kind of like this, who's kind of an undersized rebounder, um, just completely relentless, always attacking the glass, always attacking the ball, and was more than a handful to deal with. Did win a ring with the Pistons, but just a spectacular player. Um, I like defense, so he's always fun for me to watch. Filling up the stat sheet with blocks. All right, Chris. Looking to the next episode of the BackDraft podcast. What draft are we going to be breaking down?
All right, we're going to dive back into the NFL. We're going to go into the 2016 NFL draft, one of the more bad drafts I think we've probably gotten into on this podcast. So that'll be interesting to kind of dive into some of the mindsets of some of these teams and how that all kind of shook out, and how some of these careers have panned out. But excited to get into that kind of after the holidays here, and so we'll have some NFL chatter next week.
Yes, and on behalf of the Backdraft podcast, happy holidays to our listener, and happy holidays to you, Chris. I hope that Santa is good to you this
You
year.
as well. Happy holidays, everyone, and I hope everyone gets everything they want and enjoys some much needed family time.
Yep. Talk to you later.
See ya.